The Mendelssohn Violin Concerto is one of the most popular pieces in the violin repertoire. In fact, it's so popular that oftentimes it's the first major violin concerto that we learn. I first started learning when I was about 9 years old, and now as a professional, I've probably played it a few hundred times to audiences across the world. That being said though, we never stop learning. And so in today's video, I'm gonna go ahead and review, react, and try out some of the suggestions that you've made across all three movements on the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, as well as share a few of my own soloist insights and secret tips. Let's begin. So I asked everyone to leave their suggestions as well as questions in my practice app on Tonic. So for those of you who are new, I've left a link in the description below. It's completely free to download, and all of the bowings and fingerings, everything we talked about will be there for you to look at after this video. First up, we have a question from Yuto. How do you get ready in the first 2 bars before the entrance? In the beginning. That's a good question. Since that this particular concerto, you've only got like 1.5 bars before you have to start playing, unlike other concertos, which usually, have like a minute. Oh, Neres actually has a great comment. I sing the orchestra part in my head and I come in. A second before I put my bow on the string, I focus more on the feelings I want to share. Okay, try to get the emotion. That's actually a really good tip. You're imagining the sound in your mind, and then you play it. So that's always really important. I always think like, okay, what's the emotion I want to evoke? And then I think, okay, so something searching, something immediate. As Neres has mentioned, she's like, okay, I think about and away we go. So that's kind of like how I practice it. All right, next question is from August. I'm currently practicing the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto first movement. I'm having the trouble with the quicker passages. How could I practice them more effectively? Like any fast passage out there, it takes slow practice. You've all heard that before, but there's a few tricks. One trick is a mind anchor. So let's say, for example, in this first page here, that's like a pretty tricky passage. You'll notice that there are accents. So usually mind anchors are sort of like a foothold in your mind to be able to anchor down so that you can hit the refresh button so that it doesn't get overloaded and tongue twisted. So here we have 2, 3. Mind anchor, mind anchor, mind anchor. That is a tongue twister, isn't it? And then the same thing. Even on shifts as well, it works really well. I also like to use harmonics whenever I can when I shift. Really good tip there. Let's move on here. This is a question by Robert. I'm relatively new to the violin and I can't afford a violin teacher right now, but I love the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto and I really just want to learn even the first movement. What's the best way to figure out the fingerings and bowings? Well, Robert, I may have a special gift for you. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop in my personal bowings and fingerings right here. Submit, and it should be there. Moving on, how would you phrase this piece? And how would you describe Mendelssohn's style of music? Good question. Mendelssohn's music, it's very joyful. I would say that it's very quicksilver. There's always a continuation that goes on, even between the movements, right? You've got the first movement that kind of leads into the second movement with the bassoon note, right? Held there. And then you've got the second movement that goes into the third through a bridge passage, So Mendelssohn, for that matter, is extremely flowing. That's what I would say about Mendelssohn's style. How can I have a professional sound in this concerto? Ooh, that's a tough question. Sound is something really important, but there's 3 factors of sound: bow speed, bow weight, and bow location. It's all in the right hand. So bow speed, how fast you play the bow; bow location, where the bow is; and bow weight, how heavy the bow is. When you think about a professional sound, that's pretty much it on the right hand. And then on the left hand, you've got the vibrato. How quick is the vibrato? How tight is it? So wide versus narrow is how tight it is. You want it to be audible, but then you don't want it to be like too wide either. Otherwise it starts becoming too romantic. So the professional sound for Mendelssohn is definitely something that is a little tighter here, but still audible. And then as you play these notes, the phrasing is important to help with your bow speed. So you get that bow speed going. Let's do one last question. Oh my gosh, there's so many here. How to play the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto without getting tired? My hand is so sore after playing the first page. Ooh, if it's the right hand, most people get really tired because they're too tense. It's all about tension, but intentional tension. Does that make sense? What it means is, like, for example, in the right hand, making sure you pinch the bow at the right moment. So usually on the downbeats here, 1. But then releasing the note immediately after. That's so important. Most people think, oh, okay, I just need to sustain, and then they end up building up tension. They're like that. That's not the way. You want to make sure that your notes are always released. even in one phrase, because that's just how humans sing. Very important so that you don't get tired. All right, let's move on to the second movement now. Okay, next question by Jasper. My teacher keeps telling me to sustain my notes, but I'm always running out of bow. When I press into the string more, it sounds bad. Do you have any advice how to balance the perfectly between a sustained chord sound, but also being economical? Really good question here, Jasper. Let's see here. We start with an up bow. So notice how I'm very relaxed. Again, intentional tension. That's the phrase for today. What we start with is a relaxed sound. But then as I go and continue, I'm phrasing towards that second half of the bar. 1, 2, 3, here to the F. But then again to the A, G, right there, right? And as I phrase towards it, I build a bit of tension. So I used to call this inner tension. It needed to be always like very intentional. That's how you balance out having that core sound, but then also being economical. So here, for example, 1, 2, 3. So notice how I relax the sound on the B before going up to the A. That both relaxes the phrase as well as relaxes your left hand for the shift that you're about to do. You get the idea. Let's move on here a little bit more. I can get all the notes right in the second movement, but how can I make my playing more emotional? Is there a scene you keep in mind when approaching this movement? That's a great question. Think of your bow as your vocal cords. That's what I like to think. Like the sound, is it a relaxed sound or is it a tense sound? And there are moments of tension in the piece. Like for example, here in the middle section. A big tip for making things emotional, think about the emotion and not the notes. I know it sounds super basic and easy and obvious, but you'd be surprised. When we're playing, there's so many things to worry about. I'm worried about my intonation. I'm worried about my sound. Am I scratching? Do I have the bow straight? Is it in the right position? All these things make us focus instead of the music. It focuses on the technique. And that's understandable too, right? Because you're probably trying to check and make sure. But then at a certain point, you have to practice musicality. Okay, what is the mood? What is the emotion? Okay, is it something that's, carefree? Imagine where you are. In this, for imagery, I'm thinking about beautiful garden. One of those like gardens, like, in the palace, the queen is taking a walk in the park, you're like, The second movement is something that, don't overthink it. Focus mostly on getting that flowing state going. You're always going in a direction. That is what will keep the phrase moving. So before we move on to the final movement, there's this really good question. How do you balance between being lost in music and being focused at the same time? A good way to prevent yourself from getting lost in the music is to always think of it as like where we are and what is the dialogue in the music. For example, this middle section here. And then you have this like question and an answer. And then again, it's more insistent. Another way to practice the musicality and the technique together at the same time. So that's something that's really important. All right, moving on to the third and final movement here of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. Third movement, how much vibratos should you use and which vibrato will sound best? Usually when I think about fast passages, I don't think about vibrato, right? It's not the first thing that we think of. I will give you a secret tip here right now. If you vibrate ever so slightly in your left hand when you're doing runs and fast passages, it will help you. Why? Because it will make your left hand a little less tense. So for example, here, that's with a little bit of vibrato, right? Versus here. It even adds a little bit more flavor to the sound somehow. It's like a little more old school, I like to call it. You know, you're more intentional, but with the right amount where you're giving yourself a little wiggle room. I mean, that's what vibrato is, right? That really, really helps in fast passages. Vibratos should always be intentional. It's like, why are we adding it here? I think in fast movements, you don't want to over-index on vibrato. Otherwise, it could start sounding too wobbly. Like, you'll start sounding like one of those like really, really old wonky recordings. So you don't want to do that. Oh, another question here by Yuto. How do you put the anchors in the long and fast passages? Okay, this is what I call the butt clench passage. Probably the most difficult passage. There are two. This is the first one. Man, I barely made that. This passage, mind anchor, essential. We start, refresh on that, and then you strike it on the E. And then here, because there's a shift, right? You've been in basically half, but then first position. And then suddenly you have another shift here to the G sharp. And then on each shift, you want to place a mind anchor. And then final shift. So we count how many mind anchors we have. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plus the shift. The other place, which is terrifying, is the final coda section. That part. So this part, you practice it. So we have this long trill, and then the winds are going on there. And then suddenly you have this like devastating shift, right? That C sharp, that high C sharp. I actually put a mind anchor not on the C sharp itself, but on the note before, on the A, because I know that my A to C sharp, that's the reference that I have to hit the C sharp, a major third, right? So that's a little secret tip that I do there. That helps me nail that C sharp every single time. A few final questions here. What kind of style / phrasing should the beginning of the third movement have? Ooh, very good question. The beginning of the third movement, are we talking about the bridge passage or are we talking about like the actual beginning? Well, we'll cover both. So the bridge passage connects the second to the third. And it's a conversation between two people. Usually I think of the student and the master. It's like, master, why are my powers not great enough? And then the master goes, because you're not ready. And then it's like, but master. And then again, the same answer, wait until the spring when the ice thaws. When you have passed the test. And then the young sapling's like, no, I'm gonna be determined. Bruh. You know what? I was a little too determined on that note. Bum, bum, bum. And then we have the fanfare, the trumpets. Bum, bum, ba-ga-dum. It's a response. Dun, dun, da-ga-dum. Da-ga-da-ga-dum. Ba-ga-da-ga-dum. 1, 2, 3. Joseph Silverstein, he was the concertmaster of Boston Symphony, gave me this advice. He always said that you do, on these notes, most people think, oh, that they're all equal, but actually no. You go to here. And again, you have a little back and forth. And then, again, off the string is good. Try to make sure that you can, with the right hand, it's this kind of like motion of flicking the bow up with a small bounce. You need to have a somewhat loose wrist, but with an intentional sweep, a mini sweep. And when you develop this mini sweep, you can do the flying staccato at one point. that's where it eventually leads to. It's a good piece to practice that. I hope this helps. Leave me any more questions, comments, feedback that you may have, and don't be shy either. I mean, I will willingly try out your suggestions. Let's do the Bruch Violin Concerto next time. You know what? I would love to see your advice, what's worked out for you, what hasn't worked out for you for the Bruch Violin Concerto. 3 movements. Let's do it in the next video. And until then, I'll see you in your practice room on tonic. Bye. Psst, don't forget, all the bowings and fingerings right here. Enjoy.